On the cold morning of March 13th, 1996, the quiet town of Dunblane, Scotland, awoke to an event so horrifying that it would reshape the nation's laws and leave emotional scars that still linger decades later. At Dunblane Primary School, students were just beginning their day, filing into classrooms, teachers marking attendance, when Thomas Hamilton, a disgraced former scout leader with a history of concerning behavior around children, entered the school armed with 4 handguns and over 700 rounds of ammunition. In the span of just 3 minutes, Hamilton stormed into the gymnasium, where a class of 5- and 6-year-olds were gathered for physical education, and opened fire. He killed 16 children and 1 teacher, injuring many more, before turning the gun on himself. It was the deadliest mass shooting in British history, and its shockwaves were global. What stunned the public was not just the brutality of the attack, but how Hamilton was able to possess firearms legally, despite being flagged multiple times by police and local authorities. Parents and teachers had long raised concerns about his inappropriate behavior with young boys, his obsessive photography, and his unexplained presence at playgrounds. Yet no decisive action was taken. The inquiry into the massacre revealed systemic failures, including a lack of coordinated background checks and legal loopholes that allowed Hamilton to retain his gun licenses even after being deemed mentally unstable. NTHE Nation was in mourning, but grief quickly turned to outrage. Public demand for reform led to the Firearms Amendment Act 1997, effectively banning private ownership of handguns in the UK. The Dunblane massacre became not just a national trauma, but a catalyst for sweeping legislative change. Memorials were erected, including the Dunblane Memorial Garden, and the name of teacher Gwen Mayer, who died protecting her students, became synonymous with heroism in the face of horror. NFOR many, Dunblane remains a symbol of innocence lost, and the lingering question still haunts Scotland. How did so many warnings go unheeded, and why was Hamilton allowed near children at all? In the years since, Dunblane has been frequently cited in debates over school security, gun control, and government accountability. Survivors of the massacre, now adults, have spoken out about living in the shadow of tragedy, their childhood marked by the day their classroom became a battlefield.
It was the first day of school, September 1st, 2004, in the small town of Beslan, located in the North Ossetia region of southern Russia. For families across the country, it was Knowledge Day, a national celebration of education where children wore their best clothes, brought flowers for teachers, and gathered with excitement for a new school year. At school number 1, nearly 800 students, teachers, and parents assembled for a traditional opening ceremony in the courtyard. But before the morning festivities could even conclude, the sound of gunfire shattered the calm. Over 30 heavily armed terrorists linked to Chechen separatist groups stormed the campus, herding 1,200 hostages, including babies, toddlers, and the elderly, into the school gymnasium. Thus began a 3-day siege that would end in explosive bloodshed, killing 334 people, 186 of them children, and leaving a nation and the world horrified by the cruelty and chaos that unfolded in a place meant for learning. NTHE attackers, wearing explosives and masks, quickly rigged the gym with tripwires and bombs, forcing families to lie on the hard floor without food, water, or medical aid. The temperature in the gym exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, and as hours turned to days, children began collapsing from dehydration and exhaustion. Hostages who begged for water were ignored or beaten, and some who tried to escape were executed in front of the others. The terrorists made no secret of their intentions. They wanted the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya and threatened to kill hostages en masse if their demands were not met. Outside, the Russian special forces, local police, and media swarmed the school, with anxious parents lining the perimeter, listening for gunshots, desperate for news. The government's response was confused, delayed, and secretive. Officials underreported the number of hostages, and journalists were blocked from full access. On the third day, the situation erupted. Explosions tore through the gymnasium, possibly triggered by the terrorists or mishandled by security forces, igniting a fireball that collapsed part of the roof. In the chaos, Russian special forces stormed the building, and a fierce firefight ensued, with children caught in the crossfire, many trampled or burned alive. Survivors recall seeing charred bodies, blood-soaked classrooms, and the screams of parents searching for their children in the rubble.
The aftermath was catastrophic. Bodies were laid out in the local sports arena, with mothers and fathers identifying their children by clothing or jewelry, sometimes only by scraps of fabric. Questions began immediately. Why were the terrorists able to infiltrate so easily? Why was there no negotiation? Why did the siege end in such chaos? The Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin, refused to allow an independent investigation, sparking international outrage. Survivors and families of the victims accused the government of mishandling the crisis, using excessive force, and covering up the truth. To this day, official narratives conflict with survivor testimony, and the role of Russian forces in the death toll remains hotly debated. Beslan school siege wasn't just a terrorist attack. It was a symbolic massacre designed to inflict maximum psychological damage on an entire population by targeting its most innocent and vulnerable citizens. Children returned to school months later, but school number 1 never reopened. The burned-out shell of the gymnasium remains, now a memorial, filled with photos of the dead, toys, and charred remnants of schoolwork, frozen in time. Survivors, many of them still traumatized, have formed support groups demanding transparency and justice, while others have fled the region, unable to live with the memories. Beslan became a global symbol of how schools can become battlegrounds, not just for education, but for ideology, revenge, and political failure. For the children who survived, nightmares are constant, and the psychological damage deep, with many experiencing PTSD, survivors' guilt, and lifelong fear. Every year on September 1st, Russia holds remembrance ceremonies. But for many families, the grief is compounded by silence and state censorship. One mother, whose 2 children died in the siege, said, "They took our children, and now they've taken the truth. We will never heal." In the conservative post-war city of Christchurch, New Zealand, the Parker Hulme case would become the most infamous school-related crime the country had ever seen. A tale so disturbing and intimate, that it inspired films, books, and national debate for decades. It began at Christchurch Girls High School, where two highly intelligent teenagers, Pauline Parker and Juliet Home, formed a bond that was as intense as it was exclusive. Both girls were outsiders, Pauline from a working-class family, and Juliet the daughter of wealthy, intellectual British immigrants. Their friendship quickly evolved into an obsession, filled with fantasy worlds, coded language, and elaborate plans for escape. But when their parents tried to separate them, fearing the relationship was unhealthy, the girls conspired to kill Pauline's mother, a decision that would shock the nation and forever blur the line between adolescence and evil. Their friendship, at first glance, was innocent, based on shared interests in writing, music, and imaginary kingdoms. But teachers soon noticed their increasing isolation, the way they ignored other students, and the intensity of their attachment. They created an entire fantasy world called Borovnia, where they ruled as queens and wrote novels and plays about violence, betrayal, and eternal love. As Juliet's family began to experience turmoil, her parents' marriage collapsing and plans to send Juliet overseas, the girls' fear of separation turned into desperation. In their minds, Pauline's mother, Honora Parker, became the obstacle, the evil force keeping them apart. On June 22, 1954, the girls invited Honora on a walk in Victoria Park under the pretense of a picnic. Hidden in Pauline's coat was a half-brick, wrapped in a stocking, the weapon of choice for their plan. As they reached a secluded path, Pauline struck her mother from behind, and together the girls bludgeoned her to death, delivering over 45 blows. Blood-soaked and dazed, they ran back to a nearby tea shop, claiming an accident had occurred. But the police quickly uncovered the truth, finding the bloodied brick and a diary in which Pauline meticulously documented the murder plot. Their arrest and trial captivated New Zealand. The press dubbed them the Murder Girls, and debates erupted over whether their relationship was romantic, delusional, or symptomatic of mental illness. Psychiatrists examined the girls extensively, ultimately finding them sane but dangerous. The court deemed their obsession morbid, and the public fascination turned to horror as Pauline's diary entries were read aloud, revealing cold, calculated planning with no remorse. The girls were convicted of murder, but because they were only 16, they were spared the death penalty and sentenced to 5 years in prison. After their release, they vanished from public life, living under new identities. For decades, rumors circulated until it was revealed that Juliet Home had become Anne Perry, a successful crime novelist in the UK, publishing dozens of books. Pauline, living quietly in Scotland, worked with disabled children. Both women lived under the shadow of their crime, and though they never saw each other again, their story continued to haunt New Zealand's collective memory. N.T.H.E. Parker Hume case remains a cultural touchstone, raising uncomfortable questions. How did two schoolgirls become killers? Was it madness, manipulation, or a shared fantasy gone too far? Many view the crime as a warning about adolescent obsession, unchecked mental health, and the dangers of emotional isolation in youth. To this day, Pauline's diary, filled with dreamlike language and violent resolve, is studied by criminologists and psychologists, a disturbing look inside the mind of a child willing to kill for love. On April 20th, 1999, what began as an ordinary Tuesday morning at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, rapidly descended into an event so horrifying it would come to define a generation's fear of school violence. At 11:19 a.m., Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, two senior students at the school, arrived on campus armed to the teeth, carrying semi-automatic weapons, homemade bombs, and a plan to commit mass murder. Within 49 minutes, they would kill 12 students and one teacher, injure 24 others, and then turn their guns on themselves in the school library, leaving behind a legacy of terror, confusion, and unanswered questions. The Columbine Massacre was not the first school shooting in the U.S., but it became the most iconic and transformative, altering security protocols, media coverage, and national conversations about youth, mental health, gun control, and violence in culture. Eric and Dylan were considered outcasts, though that term masks the complexity of their lives. Both boys came from middle-class families, had access to computers and hobbies, and were often seen laughing with friends in video footage. Yet underneath, Eric Harris maintained a detailed website, laced with violent fantasies, death threats, and bomb-making instructions. Dylan Klebold kept a journal of anguish, self-hatred, and growing despair. Together they recorded videotapes, known later as the basement tapes, where they outlined their plans and mocked their future victims, referring to the massacre as Judgment Day. Their plan was meticulous and far-reaching. They intended to detonate propane bombs in the cafeteria to kill hundreds, then pick off survivors as they fled. When the bombs failed to explode, the pair entered the school shooting indiscriminately, starting at the west entrance. Witnesses recall them laughing, taunting students, and asking victims to pray before shooting them. The brutality was unrelenting. In the library, where most of the killings occurred, they executed students hiding under tables, including Cassie Bernal, whose story, Whether She Said Yes to a Question About Faith Before Being Shot, became a symbolic, controversial narrative that would be debated for years. Police and SWAT response was slow and cautious, hindered by confusion, lack of training, and the belief that the shooters were still active. Meanwhile, trapped students called 911, hid in closets, or fled through broken windows. Parents stood outside, watching in horror, unsure if their children were alive. At 12:08 p.m., the killers committed suicide, leaving behind chaos and devastation. The scene inside was apocalyptic. Bodies lying among blood pools, gunpowder smoke clinging to the air, alarms blaring endlessly.
In the aftermath, the media descended, hungry for explanations. Blame was directed at violent video games, music, particularly Marilyn Manson, bullying, and mental illness. But as investigations unfolded, the truth proved more elusive and disturbing. Eric and Dylan did not act in a vacuum. Warning signs were missed, including Harris's prior arrest, psychiatric evaluations, and threats posted online. The pair had acquired weapons through a friend, exploiting lax gun laws. Their parents, especially the Klebolds, were devastated, later acknowledging they had no idea of the darkness brewing in their homes. Columbine was a watershed moment, leading to lockdown drills, school security overhauls, and a cultural obsession with understanding school shooters. Yet it also sparked copycat attacks, and the names Eric and Dylan became twisted icons among certain online subcultures. Survivors, including teachers and injured students, have shared their trauma publicly, many becoming advocates for gun control and mental health awareness. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Columbine is its enduring sense of unanswered questions. Why did it happen? Could it have been prevented? Who failed to act? 2 decades later, the school still stands, but the library was demolished, replaced by a memorial, and the name Columbine remains etched in the global consciousness. A synonym for school shootings, youthful rage, and the terrible fragility of safety. On February 7, 1977, the peaceful routine of a one-room rural schoolhouse in Ennis, Victoria, Australia, was shattered by an event so surreal and terrifying it would become the first classroom hostage situation in Australian history. That morning, teacher Mary Gibbs and her 9 students, aged between 6 and 12, had just settled in for their lessons when 2 armed men, later identified as Robert Boland and James Larkin, both Vietnam War veterans suffering from untreated PTSD, entered the school carrying rifles, homemade explosives, and chains. Within moments, the children and their teacher were tied up, the windows and doors were barricaded, and the small schoolroom had been turned into a prison. What followed was a 14-hour standoff that would test the limits of police negotiation, expose cracks in veteran support systems, and leave an entire country asking, how could war follow 2 men home and end up in a classroom full of children?
The kidnappers' motive was as confused as it was desperate. Boland and Larkin, embittered by what they viewed as government neglect of war veterans, wanted $2 million in compensation, public apologies, and safe passage out of the country. Their plan involved using the children as bargaining chips, demanding a media presence to broadcast their grievances. As police, media, and parents descended on the remote schoolhouse, the story unfolded on live television. Viewers watching in horrified fascination as news helicopters circled overhead and the Australian Special Operations Group began assembling. Inside the classroom, Mary Gibbs remained calm, despite being chained to a desk alongside her students. She spoke in a soothing tone, shielded the children from sight of the weapons, and carefully tracked time using a clock on the wall, reassuring the children that help was coming soon. Boland, the more volatile of the 2, periodically ranted about betrayal, his voice rising as he threatened to detonate a homemade bomb strapped to his chest. Larkin, by contrast, appeared nervous and apologetic, even offering water to the students at one point. Negotiators attempted to communicate through a megaphone, offering food and cigarettes in exchange for the release of some children, but Boland refused. Hours dragged on, the temperature inside the classroom rose, and panic began to take hold. One child began vomiting from fear, another wet himself, and Gibbs, in a moment of pure maternal instinct, managed to calm them all, telling stories from fairy tales to distract them from the terror surrounding them. At 8:12 p.m., a breakthrough occurred. Larkin asked to speak to his wife and broke down sobbing during the call. While distracted, Gibbs signaled one of the older students, 12-year-old Jackie Miller, to edge towards the window. Jackie managed to unlock it quietly, slipped out, and ran to police, delivering a crucial detail. The explosive's trigger mechanism was in Boland's left jacket pocket. Within minutes, tactical teams breached the schoolhouse, using flashbang grenades to disorient the captors. A shot rang out. Boland had fired but missed and was tackled and subdued. Larkin surrendered without resistance. Miraculously, none of the children were harmed, and Gibbs was hailed as a national hero, awarded the Order of Australia for her bravery. But the psychological scars ran deep. Several students experienced nightmares for years, and the community of Ennis, once an anonymous farming town, became a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience. The incident ignited a national conversation about mental health care for veterans and school security in rural areas. A parliamentary inquiry found that both Boland and Larkin had sought help repeatedly, but were denied effective treatment, their condition misdiagnosed or ignored. In court, Boland was sentenced to life in prison, while Larkin received 20 years due to his cooperation and remorse. During sentencing, Larkin apologized directly to the children, many of whom were in the courtroom as young adults. He said, "I was lost in the war, and I brought that war into your lives. I will never forgive myself. Today, the schoolhouse still stands, now converted into a museum honoring Gibbs and her students." Every February 7th, the town holds a silent vigil. The school bell rung once for every life spared. The Ennis abduction is taught in Australian schools not just as a crime, but as a lesson in courage, mental health awareness, and the unpredictable aftershocks of war. Long before names like Columbine or Sandy Hook would dominate headlines, the most devastating act of school violence in American history occurred in the small farming community of Bath Township, Michigan, on May 18, 1927. On that day, a school treasurer and angry local farmer, Andrew Kehoe, carried out a meticulously planned bombing that would kill 38 school children, 6 adults, and injure over 50 more. An act so cold-blooded, it would haunt survivors for decades and yet somehow fade from public memory. The Bath school disaster remains the deadliest school massacre in U.S. history, but its details are often overlooked, buried beneath the weight of modern tragedies. Kehoe was known in Bath Township as a quiet, methodical man, often described as intelligent but aloof, with a reputation for cruelty, especially towards animals and his ailing wife, Nellie Kehoe. He was deeply involved in local politics, serving as treasurer of the school board, but was also embroiled in financial troubles, his farm failing and mortgage payments overdue. Kehoe blamed the new school taxes for his economic woes and grew increasingly obsessed with perceived injustices, often muttering that the town was bleeding him dry. In FOR months, Kehoe plotted revenge against the town. He purchased explosives under the guise of farm use, mostly pyrrolitol and dynamite, leftovers from World War I. He began planting these beneath the Bath Consolidated School, which had opened just a few years earlier and was a source of civic pride. With his background in maintenance work, Kehoe had access to the school's basement, allowing him to rig hundreds of pounds of explosives beneath the children's classrooms undetected. At approximately 8:45 a.m. on May 18th, Kehoe murdered his wife, burned down his farmhouse, and detonated the first explosion, destroying the school's north wing just as classes had begun. Witnesses described a deafening blast, followed by the horrific sound of children screaming as the building collapsed. Parents and townspeople rushed to the school, many pulling children from the rubble with their bare hands, only to find small bodies mangled beyond recognition. The local undertaker's office was overwhelmed, and the town hall was converted into a makeshift morgue. N.B.U.T. Kehoe wasn't finished. As survivors gathered outside, he drove a truck into the crowd, luring people closer. The truck, packed with more explosives and metal debris, detonated in a second blast, killing Kehoe himself, the school superintendent, and several others. Authorities later discovered that an additional 500 pounds of unexploded dynamite had been hidden under the school's south wing, which, had it detonated, would have obliterated the entire building and doubled the death toll. In the aftermath, Bath was paralyzed by grief and disbelief. Funerals were held in waves, many for multiple children from the same families. One couple lost all 3 of their children. Another parent collapsed upon identifying their child by a ribbon, the only recognizable detail. Newspapers from across the country arrived, but the town quickly withdrew from media attention, overwhelmed by the magnitude of its loss. A nationwide relief fund was created, donations pouring in from President Calvin Coolidge, Henry Ford, and ordinary citizens. Newshaw's motives were detailed in a single chilling sign found on his property. Criminals are made, not born. Theories abound: financial ruin, mental illness, narcissistic rage, but no definitive explanation has ever been agreed upon. The Bath school disaster, while historically significant, was eventually overshadowed by other tragedies, and today, few outside of Michigan know the story. In 1928, a memorial was erected, and the school was rebuilt, but for survivors, the memories remain vivid: the sound of the blast, the sight of twisted metal, and the endless rows of coffins. The town now holds an annual remembrance, and the names of the victims are etched into a monument near the former school site. For many, Bath stands as a reminder of how the worst acts of violence can stem from simmering resentment, and how even the most familiar faces can harbor unthinkable rage. On a quiet spring morning in Kobe, Japan, on May 27, 1997, a school janitor discovered a severed human head placed atop the front gate of Tainohata Elementary School, eyes open and mouth twisted in an eerie grin. Stuffed in the mouth was a chilling note, handwritten in red ink, proclaiming, "This is the beginning of the game. I despise your education system." What followed was an investigation that shocked Japan to its core, as the killer was soon revealed to be a 14-year-old boy who would become known by his alias Saito Sakakibara, and whose crimes were not only grisly, but raised frightening questions about juvenile violence, mental health, and society's hidden undercurrents.
The gruesome discovery at Tainohata Elementary wasn't the first sign that something was wrong in Kobe. Weeks earlier, on March 16, 1997, two elementary school girls, aged 10 and 11, were attacked by an unknown assailant wielding a hammer. One survived with head injuries. The other was left in a coma. Just a week later, two dead cats were found nailed to a school gate nearby. A macabre warning that something or someone was escalating. Then, on May 24th, the body of 11-year-old Jun Hase, a cheerful student at Tainohata Elementary, was found decapitated. His head later placed deliberately for maximum impact. NTHE City descended into panic. Parents escorted children in groups, schools installed emergency alarms, and the media frenzy was relentless. The note left in the mouth of Jun Hase's severed head was filled with rage, criticizing the Japanese school system and societal pressure. Signed, Seito Sakakibara, a name that would become infamous overnight. The tone was mocking, the words carefully chosen, expressing hatred of authority and vowing that more would die. NTHE police, overwhelmed by public pressure, conducted widespread interviews and eventually, through surveillance and tip-offs, zeroed in on a local junior high school student. On June 28, 1997, they arrested a 14-year-old boy who confessed to the murder of Jun Hase, the hammer attacks, and several acts of animal cruelty. In his room, investigators found notebooks filled with drawings of violence, dissections, and disturbing essays idolizing serial killers. He had also written of feeling trapped in a society of insects, expressing contempt for teachers and peers, and fantasizing about killing as a form of personal freedom. NTHE arrest sent shockwaves through Japan. Until then, juvenile crime was rare, especially acts of such extreme violence. The public was horrified not only by the crimes but by the youthful face behind them. Due to Japan's juvenile law, his real name was never released, and his sentencing was in juvenile custody with a maximum detention of 7 years. Many citizens demanded legal reforms, furious that someone who beheaded a child might one day walk free. Politicians pushed for lowering the age of criminal responsibility, and media outlets questioned the ethics of anonymity in such horrific cases.
During psychiatric evaluations, the boy was diagnosed with schizophrenic tendencies, psychopathic traits, and a deep-seated disconnect from empathy. He later stated he killed to feel alive, and that watching his victims suffer gave him clarity and peace. He wrote in his journal, "I am God. I have given and taken life. The world is finally real." And after serving 7 years in a reformatory, he was released in 2004, sparking widespread protests. His whereabouts remain unknown, though rumors suggest he underwent plastic surgery and now lives under state protection. In 2005, he wrote a public apology letter to Jun Hase's family, but they dismissed it as hollow, believing, quote, "true remorse cannot exist in someone capable of such horror." NTHE Kobe child murders forever altered Japan's view of juvenile crime, and the image of innocence in schools was deeply shaken. The gate where Jun Hase's head was placed was torn down, replaced with a stone monument and cherry tree, but many believe the memory cannot be erased. The name Sakakibara became a symbol of the unknown darkness that can reside within youth, and the case is still cited in debates about age, responsibility, and evil. In Bolingbrook, Illinois, a seemingly quiet suburb southwest of Chicago, Sergeant Drew Peterson was a well-known figure, a long-serving police officer, father of 4, and neighborhood fixture. To many, he seemed charismatic, confident, and even charming, the kind of man who always had a story to tell and a smile to offer. But beneath that uniformed veneer, Peterson harbored a dark history of control, manipulation, and abuse, especially when it came to his wives. And in October 2007, when his fourth wife, Stacey Ann Peterson, just 23 years old, vanished without a trace, the facade began to crack, revealing one of the most chilling and public unravelings of a law enforcement officer turned prime suspect in a possible murder. Stacey had met Drew Peterson when she was just 17 years old, a high school student working at a hotel where Peterson was a guest. He was 30 years her senior and still married to his third wife, Kathleen Savio. Despite the age gap and controversy, they began a relationship. Within 2 years, Stacey was pregnant and Drew divorced Savio. Shortly after, Savio was found dead in her bathtub, her hair soaked in blood. The scene initially ruled an accidental drowning, despite numerous red flags and signs of struggle. At the time, the ruling was accepted, largely because of Peterson's influence and connections within the local police force. NBY, the time Stacey went missing, she and Drew's marriage was falling apart. She had confided in family and friends that she wanted to leave him, fearing for her life. She spoke of being watched constantly, of arguments escalating, and of Peterson's erratic behavior. On the morning of October 28, 2007, Stacey failed to show up for a scheduled visit with her sister. Calls went unanswered. Peterson claimed Stacey had run off with another man, abandoning her children, a claim no one believed. NTHE Media quickly latched onto the story. Peterson, in a series of bizarre TV interviews, came across as flippant, joking, and unconcerned, famously appearing on a radio show to auction off his dead wife's belongings. His demeanor only intensified suspicion, and when authorities began reinvestigating the death of Kathleen Savio, they exhumed her body. A second autopsy revealed she had died from blunt force trauma, consistent with homicide, not an accident. Peterson was now suspect number 1 in 2 cases, 1 confirmed murder and 1 likely disappearance. Despite mounting evidence, Peterson remained free for years, using legal loopholes and taunting the press, even attempting to launch a reality TV show. But prosecutors were strategic, building a case around circumstantial evidence, and most critically, statements Stacey had made before her disappearance. A legal tactic called Drew's Law was passed in Illinois, allowing hearsay evidence in court if the witness was unavailable due to the defendant's actions. In 2012, Peterson was convicted of murdering Kathleen Savio, sentenced to 38 years in prison. During trial, former friends, neighbors, and even fellow officers testified about Peterson's history of domestic violence, threats, and controlling behavior. Though Stacey's body was never found, authorities believe she was murdered to prevent her from testifying in Savio's case. In prison, Peterson continued to make headlines, caught plotting to kill the prosecutor who convicted him, an act that added an additional 40 years to his sentence. NTHE, Drew Peterson case became a cultural lightning rod, raising questions about abuse of police authority, the failures of the justice system to protect vulnerable women, and the psychological profile of domestic abusers who operate under public trust. Stacy's family continues to search for her remains, holding vigils, and advocating for domestic violence awareness. Her disappearance became a national symbol of how abusers can hide in plain sight, protected by power, charm, and a badge, until the truth finally catches up. In Seoul, South Korea, the students of Jangwon Middle School considered their ethics teacher, Park Sun-ho, to be an unusually charismatic and persuasive figure. Known for passionate lectures about morality, discipline, and spiritual purity, Park quickly became a favorite among students and parents alike. But behind the closed doors of his after-school leadership program, he was constructing something far more sinister, a covert cult, one that would draw in dozens of students, brainwash them with rituals, separate them from their families, and ultimately lead to physical abuse, psychological trauma, and the collapse of a community's trust in its own educators. It began innocuously enough in 2010, when Park invited select students to join his special ethics circle, an exclusive mentorship group that met outside parents, initially flattered their children were chosen, consented eagerly. Park emphasized discipline, loyalty, and personal growth, but quickly introduced private sessions, where he spoke of spiritual awakening, purification rites, and the need to cut ties with impure influences. Soon, students were isolated, told that their families were corrupting them, and that only Park could guide them to clarity. NTHE meetings escalated into secret nighttime gatherings at abandoned classrooms, where Park conducted rituals involving chanting, sleep deprivation, and confession circles. Students were required to confess sins, which ranged from disobeying parents to questioning Park's authority. Those who resisted were shamed, forced to stand for hours, or perform self-purification exercises that bordered on physical punishment. Park told them they were chosen for a higher purpose, to spread his ethics of absolute loyalty and become disciples of a coming age of purity.
In 2012, a 14-year-old girl, Kim So-yeon, collapsed during one of the overnight sessions and was rushed to the hospital by her parents, who had begun suspecting something was wrong. The girl was severely dehydrated, malnourished, and had bruises on her arms and back. Under questioning, she broke down and confessed everything. The police, skeptical at first, launched an investigation that uncovered layers of secrecy, including coded journals, hidden cameras, and a network of student watchers who reported on peers trying to escape Park's influence. NTHE school administration was complicit in silence, fearing reputational damage. Park had long been admired, had received awards, and no one wanted to believe he could be capable of such manipulation and abuse. But the testimony of dozens of students, some of whom had attempted self-harm, painted a horrific picture of psychological conditioning, sleep deprivation, and ritualistic control. Park was arrested and charged with child abuse, unlawful detention, and psychological torture. In court, Park denied wrongdoing, claiming he was merely teaching discipline in a decaying society. He portrayed himself as a moral savior, and, disturbingly, several of his former students testified in his defense, clearly still under his sway. One student declared, "He showed us the truth. You people just don't understand." It took months of deprogramming and therapy to begin breaking Park's influence on many of the children. And Park was sentenced to 18 years in prison, but the damage lingered. Families were torn apart, the school was shut down, and the case sparked national debate about mental control, educational oversight, and the power imbalance between teachers and students. South Korea's Ministry of Education instituted strict policies banning private mentorship programs and requiring mental health training for teachers. Still, many believe the case was just the tip of the iceberg, a sign of how charisma and authority can be twisted into control, even in the most sacred places of learning.
In the bustling city of Manchester, England, students at Westbrook Secondary School knew Mr. Adrian Keller as a quiet, somewhat reserved ICT, information and communication technology teacher. Always polite, with an unassuming demeanor and a neatly buttoned shirt, Keller kept to himself, rarely engaging in the typical gossip or camaraderie of the staff room. He was respected for his technical knowledge, even running an after-school coding club that attracted many students interested in programming and digital media. But behind the glowing screens and quiet lessons, Keller was hiding a chilling double life as one of the UK's most prolific online predators, operating a network of fake identities, targeting his own students, and using his role as an educator to access vulnerable children under the guise of mentorship. It began with whispers. In early 2019, a 13-year-old student, Emily Clark, confided in her older sister that she had been chatting online with a man named Jaden, who claimed to be 15 years old, shared her interests in video games, and always seemed to know what she was doing at school. Emily grew increasingly withdrawn, anxious, and secretive, and her parents noticed late-night phone use and frequent mood swings. Alarmed, her sister accessed the chat logs and discovered explicit messages, threats disguised as challenges, and disturbing references to private school events no outsider should know about. When authorities were alerted, a cybercrimes unit traced Jaden to a masked IP address, but with enough digital forensics, they eventually linked the account to a school-issued laptop logged in under Adrian Keller's name. What followed was a harrowing investigation, revealing that Keller had created dozens of online personas, carefully crafted with fake photos, voice changers, and social media accounts mimicking teenage life. His targets were students at his own school, and he often used information gleaned from private files and class interactions to make his online personas more convincing. Keller would groom students, coaxing them into sending images, sharing secrets, and eventually meeting in secluded parts of the school under various pretexts, including after-school help, club activities, or private tutorials. Investigators found hidden cameras in his classroom, including one concealed inside a wall-mounted speaker, capturing footage of students without their knowledge. He stored terabytes of data, meticulously categorized by name, age, and date across encrypted drives at his home, NTHE revelation rocked the school, with hundreds of students and parents called in for interviews, counseling, and forensic device checks. It became clear that at least 18 students had been directly targeted, while dozens more were under potential risk. Keller, when arrested, initially denied all charges, but cracked under interrogation, admitting that he had lost control and became addicted to the power and anonymity the online world gave him. His calm demeanor in court unnerved many. He showed no remorse, claiming, "Online, no one knows who you are." That's what makes it safe and dangerous. And Keller was convicted on 38 counts of child exploitation, possession of indecent images, and abuse of power, sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 25 years. During sentencing, the judge remarked, "You did not simply betray your role as a teacher. You weaponized trust, education, and technology to prey upon the very children you were meant to protect." In the aftermath, Westbrook Secondary School was closed for 2 weeks, its reputation in tatters. The Department for Education launched a nationwide review of school digital policies, mandating strict monitoring of staff technology use, firewalls, and independent audits of extracurricular programs. Survivors struggled with long-term trauma, and several students required intensive psychological support, suffering from depression, anxiety, and PTSD. And Keller's case ignited a national conversation about the risks of technology in schools, the need for vigilant digital safeguarding, and the hidden threats posed by those who exploit online anonymity. Parents across the UK were urged to closely monitor children's digital interactions, while schools adopted zero-tolerance policies for unsupervised staff-student online communication. Today, Keller's name is synonymous with the dangers of predators in positions of trust, and his case is cited in teacher training seminars and digital safety programs as a grim reminder. Even behind the kindest smile and calmest demeanor, there may lurk a predator, and the first screen may be a doorway to the unthinkable. As principal of East Bay High School, she was a symbol of integrity, discipline, and excellence, known for her stern yet fair demeanor. Her school boasted high academic achievement, low dropout rates, and a spotless record with the Department of Education. But behind the polished surface, Keller harbored secrets, and her drive to maintain absolute control and reputation would lead her down a path of fraud, abuse of power, and ultimately a criminal conspiracy that stunned Australia. The chain of events began with a student's suicide, a 15-year-old girl named Eloise Hart, who leapt from a bridge on a cold April morning in 2005. Her death rocked the school. Initial reports cited bullying and personal struggles, but whispers circulated about disciplinary actions and harsh punishment from school authorities. Eloise had reportedly been caught cheating on a math test, then suspended in isolation, a punishment known locally as the room, an unused supply closet Keller had converted into a detention space devoid of windows, with only a single desk and chair. It was unofficial, unregulated, and completely secret. NTHE's story might have ended in tragedy and silence, but Eloise's mother, Anna Hart, a nurse at the local hospital, refused to accept the narrative. She launched her own investigation, uncovering journal entries from her daughter that referenced the room, hours of silence, threats from staff, and above all, Principal Geller's obsession with obedience. One haunting entry read, "She watches us all the time. You can't escape her eyes. The room isn't empty. It's full of her rules." Nana went public. The Department of Education, now under scrutiny, began digging into East Bay High's records and discovered massive irregularities, including dozens of unreported detentions, students punished off the record, and most shockingly, forged academic results submitted to the state to maintain funding and accolades. Under pressure, a whistleblower emerged, a young English teacher named Mark Dillon, who had been part of the Inner Circle, a select group of staff who knew of the secret detentions and altered grades, but were complicit due to fear and loyalty.
According to Dillon, Geller maintained her control through a pact of silence, blackmailing staff with personal information, monitoring private communications, and rewarding loyalty with bonuses and promotions. Teachers who questioned her were transferred or fired quietly, and students who resisted her authority were targeted for disciplinary action, often exaggerated or fabricated. And as the scandal unfolded, multiple former students came forward, describing psychological abuse, threats, and isolation tactics. The school counselor, herself under Geller's control, was found to have suppressed reports of student depression and shredded complaints submitted anonymously. Geller was arrested in August 2005 and charged with fraud, psychological abuse, evidence tampering, and criminal misconduct. In court, her stone-faced silence unnerved the public. Her only comment, "Order must be preserved, they needed to learn." She was sentenced to 25 years, with no possibility of parole for 15. The trial was broadcast across national television, with Geller's image, once that of a model educator, now etched into the public memory as a manipulative tyrant. NTHE aftermath led to nationwide policy changes in school oversight, including mandatory external audits, student mental health protocols, and the banning of isolated detention spaces. The room where Eloise Hart spent her final days was sealed, later transformed into a memorial space, with a plaque that reads, "Let no voice be silenced here again."
Even now, residents of Ballina speak of Geller's legacy in hushed tones. Some blame themselves for not seeing the signs. Others wonder how many other schools might harbor leaders so obsessed with control they would rather risk everything than allow a single crack in their perfect image. In the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, in 2011, one of the most prestigious public schools in the district, Springfield Elementary, found itself at the center of what would become one of the largest academic fraud scandals in U.S. history. At the heart of it was Lisa Green, a veteran fifth-grade teacher, beloved by parents and praised by administrators. Known for her near-perfect student test scores, she was a district-wide success story, held up as a model educator. But as whispers grew about how her students, often struggling in other subjects, consistently scored at the top of the charts in state-standardized tests, a disturbing truth began to surface. Green wasn't teaching her students how to succeed. She was teaching them how to cheat. And behind her was a systemic conspiracy driven by pressure, fear, and ambition. NFOR years. Lisa Green had worked tirelessly, often staying late, running weekend test prep boot camps, and creating custom workbooks for her class. She was showered with awards, promoted to lead curriculum advisor, and even featured in local news segments about turning underperforming schools around. But some of her colleagues grew suspicious when students who barely read at grade level aced complex comprehension exams, and when test scores across the district began to rise in impossible unison. In early 2011, an anonymous whistleblower sent a letter to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation alleging that teachers across several Atlanta schools were altering test answers, with Green named as a key orchestrator. Investigators launched a covert operation, collecting testing materials, surveillance footage, and conducting interviews. What they uncovered was staggering. Erased and corrected answer sheets, identical essay responses, and a secret after-hours meeting held by Green and other teachers to review answer sheets before submission. Lisa Green, when confronted, denied everything. But investigators obtained text messages between her and other educators, using code words like, quote, correcting the canvas and clearing the path, references to erasing wrong answers and ensuring students passed at all costs. Some teachers, fearing legal action, confessed, revealing that Green had pressured them to comply, saying, quote, if we don't hit those numbers, we're all out of a job. Help these kids, no one else will. NTHE district superintendent, principals, and over 30 educators were implicated, with Green labeled as one of the central figures. In court, prosecutors presented forensic evidence, erasure patterns showing changed answers, bonus paychecks tied to test performance, and emails where Green boasted about saving the school from budget cuts. She argued that the system was broken and that she, quote, did what had to be done to protect her students and staff from a brutal, numbers-driven system that punished failure. Despite her defense, Lisa Green was convicted of racketeering, fraud, and tampering with public records, sentenced to 12 years in prison, with 8 to be served behind bars. The case sent shockwaves through the nation, with headlines decrying the state of public education, the toxic pressure of standardized testing, and how educators were driven to crime by a system that valued data over children. And parents of Green's former students were devastated. Some students felt betrayed, others confused, unable to reconcile the caring teacher they knew with the criminal she became. She told me I could do anything, one student said, but now I don't know if I ever really earned it. NTHE Atlanta cheating scandal prompted nationwide reform, including reduced emphasis on standardized testing, independent oversight, and whistleblower protections for educators. But for many, the line between victim and villain remains blurred. Was Lisa Green a criminal or the symptom of a broken system? The question still hangs over the city, and her case is now taught in education ethics courses, a stark reminder of how ambition, fear, and flawed incentives can corrode even the noblest intentions.